Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome from ACT. This is our first webinar on behalf of the Welsh Government, and we've been working with them on a project looking at citizenship and politics. And so today we're running a webinar led by Zoe, our Head of Education and Professional Development, and Lee from the University of Middlesex. And they've been working with us on some guidance for schools about maintaining impartiality. We hope you enjoy the session, and I'm going to hand straight over to Zoe and to Lee.
Thank you very much, Liz. Hello, everybody. As Liz has said, I'm Zoe, and I'm very much looking forward to working with you this evening. And we also have Lee here as well. So we're going to be the two people taking you through the main event. I have just popped a message into the chat for those of you that may not have seen it so far, just to let everybody know that there may be contributions coming this evening in Welsh during our session, which of course we very much welcome. We have an interpretation service into English. If you are not a Welsh speaker and need to listen to the English, we'd like you please to go to the globe at the bottom of your screen, or 3 dots stroke more on an iPad, and select English. Welsh speakers don't need to make a language selection as they understand both. Please ensure you're muted and less contributing to avoid background noise that could obscure the sound of the speaker. So I'll just take a moment or two to make sure that everybody is able to select the language that they need to. So those of you who would like to listen in English, please select that from the globe, and Welsh speakers do not need to select any language. If you would like to make contributions this evening, please feel free to do so. You can type them into the chat box as we're going along. And of course, we very much welcome those in Welsh as well. And our translator will be able to translate those too as we go along. We want to keep this evening as informal as we can, really, and there will be breakout groups for you to work in. So please do feel free to sort of ask questions as we go. There is going to be a question session at the end, but we don't want you to hold on to them till then, because I know personally from being in sessions, sometimes you can get to the stage at the end and go, well, I can't remember what I was going to ask. So, you know, type them out or raise your hand. Hopefully we've all used enough Zooms now to know where that function is. But again, if you just go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions section. You can raise your hand electronically, or if you do have your picture up, you can raise your hands physically, and one of my colleagues will be able to find you. Also, to let you know, you would have seen that we are recording the session, and that is because this is going to be available after to continue with your professional learning, and for those that haven't been able to attend today, and it will be released via Hub later on, probably I think in September, to go with some more resources that we're producing, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So let's get on, because we've got lots to do and not much time to do it in. So, overview of our session then, we are looking at how teachers can plan for progression oh, sorry, I've just gone a little bit too far, getting a bit excited. How pupils can plan for progression in political understanding, how to ensure your teaching is politically impartial, and how to handle controversial and sensitive political issues in the classroom, and principles to apply to your practice. So these are the main parts of the webinar that we'll be taking you through this evening. So we're going to start off nice and quickly in thinking about planning and progression. So we're very aware that there's a new curriculum coming out in Wales, and that the Curriculum for Wales 2022 is something I'm sure that many of your schools have started to think about, and we've been looking at that as well. And as part of that, we're aware that there are new progression steps that students or learners will be encouraged to look at. So I'd just like to start with the first bit of interaction and participation. So I hope you're not too tired, and I know it's the end of the year and it's been a particularly challenging year. So thank you in advance for taking part in this part and not being passengers along for the ride. What does a politically literate 16-year-old look like? I just want us to start to think about that. If you were going to meet a 16-year-old in the street, hold a conversation with them, or say you were sitting down at a dinner table and you started to talk about politics and all things political, what would make you say, wow, that young person is a politically literate young person? Now, please do feel free to use the chat box to enter your ideas, or if you'd like to unmute so we can talk to you, that would be really helpful as well. And if you are making a contribution in the chat box, it would be very helpful for us to know where you're from, sort of what school you're from and what area that is, because we're really interested to know who we're working with this evening as well. So it'd be good to know who we're working with and any ideas that you have about political literate 16-year-olds. What would they look like? What would that ideal political literate 16-year-old look like? For example, would they be able to talk to you about who is currently sitting in Senate? Would they know perhaps about local council leaders? What kinds of things would you expect them to be able to do? Feel free to unmute and share some ideas, or pop it into the chat box with me. And I'm going to open up the chat box so I can see if anyone's been brave enough to share anything yet. Thank you. So we've had a suggestion, somebody who understands what politics is, how it works in Wales and the UK, and how they can get involved in a democratic process. Brilliant. So let's unpick the democratic process a little bit more. What elements do you think the democratic process might be, perhaps? Thank you. So Katie, understand the political system, know how to vote. Brilliant. And that's an important part of the democratic process, isn't it? Thank you very much, Katie from Newport. Some names of politicians. Yeah, I think that would be quite key, wouldn't it? To know who we're talking about. Ellen, thank you. I've got your comments here coming through. Engage, interested in taking part in local youth forum, brilliant. Contributing and having an opinion, Welsh Youth Parliament, and understanding democracy. Yep, brilliant, thank you so much. Elizabeth, know the names of current government, have their own opinions based on decisions, and you're in Pembrokeshire, I think that stands for. Thank you. Thanks, Helena from Cardiff. Understanding of different political parties, the idea of devolution, and names of politicians. Brilliant. Thank you, guys. Hello, Wendy. South Wales University. Brilliant. Interesting focus there. Good. Left wing and right wing would impress you, as well as current issues and the news. Yeah. Gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could get young people to be engaged in the news? What's happened to sitting down and watching the news on a daily basis? Perhaps that's something we should do in schools now. Current affairs. Thank you, Rachel. Also in Cardiff. Parliament and government. Thank you, Liz. Aware of the big issues which shape our daily lives. Thank you, Edward. Have you got any other ideas about what those big, I agree. So what do we think those big issues that shape our daily lives might be? Has anyone sort of want to help unpick that? Because I'm absolutely agreeing that our political aware or political literate 16-year-old could have an idea of what the political processes are, but being politically literate might be a bit more than that. Youth engagement is great. Nice, thank you, Wendy. We've got climate change, immigration, COVID-19, poverty. Fantastic. And being able to link these issues back, and the idea of what these issues are, being able to link them back to the politics and policies that affect them, is a really, really strong evidence that young people, the learners that you work with and that we all work with, are politically literate. Thank you very much, everybody. So let's have a look at what the progression step for 16-year-olds suggests young people should be able to do. Now, we need to remember that the idea of citizenship and politics education is actually sort of covered all across the new curriculum for Wales. In the 4 principles, there is the principle around ethically informed citizens. So it's there as part of one of the 4 principles. And in addition to that, it underlies in a number of the areas of learning, especially within humanities, but also within language and communications and within health and well-being. And these are some of the very clear statements that you can pick out of progression step 5, and some of the things that you there yourselves agreed with, saying, yeah, this is what a politically literate 16-year-old should look like. So we picked up on this idea of local, national, global government systems, and here we want the young person to be able to evaluate this. So not just describe, but by the time they get to progression step 5, they need to have gone beyond that. They need to be evaluating. And again, looking at this idea of injustice and inequality, human rights violations. So that's sort of Edward's comments about those big issues. And we also saw Wendy being able to talk about the idea of inequality, COVID-19, poverty, etc. And those issues all feed into the idea of those key terms, I guess, that we can pick out from that statement. Important of roles played by individuals, societies and social movements and governments. So we do need to remember that there are a range of peoples that are involved, or a range of people involved, range of groups involved, to make sure that everybody's rights and sort of political rights, social rights, etc., are all protected, and it's not just sort of placed at one person's door. And looking at this sort of main core of the curriculum here, this idea of being an ethically informed citizen who can critically evaluate, is very important too. And so it continues using inference and deduction about complex texts. So this comes under the language and communication, but also evaluate the reliability, validity and impact. So perhaps when you're a politically literate 16-year-old, you can look at news media and you can look at political leaflets and work out what they mean and what influence, importantly, they have on you. You can read empathetically and work out how this information will help you arrive at your considered conclusions. So when you're making a political decision, you can come to your conclusions, but you understand the reading that you're doing will affect you. And finally, of course, you can communicate your views on things, because being politically aware is more than about just understanding. It's about communicating and choosing to take action. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Lee next to continue.
Okay, thanks, Zoe. So I think we get a sense here that one of the problems with talking about citizenship and politics is this desire that children build their competence to engage with a range of topical issues. And of course, the trouble with that is there are thousands of them, and every community will generate its own urgent topical issues. But we also need to make sure we're doing more than just providing a holding space for a bunch of disparate and unrelated topical political conversations to happen. And the way we do that, or the way we're suggesting we do it, is to plan it conceptually in the same way that you would plan your provision of any subject area over time. So this is a really crude pictorial representation of something that we'll probably all recognize, the spiral curriculum. And what it requires us to do is to think about what are the issues that we revisit in the spiral curriculum. So if you're dealing with a local planning issue, it's unlikely you'll return to that planning issue every year, because that would just become repetitive unless it was some sustained campaign that you're all participating in. So you might cover different topics every year. So what is it we're coming back to in this spiral? What is it we're revisiting? And the answer is, it's those core political concepts. Now, one of the reasons for doing that, can you move on, Zoe, is to develop greater depth. But Jerome Bruner, who developed this idea of scaffolding learners through the spiral curriculum, puts it like this. It's a really kind of profound way to think about what's happening with those concepts. He says the foundations of any subject can be taught to anybody at any age in some form. To be in command of those basic ideas, to use them effectively, requires a continual deepening of one's understanding of them. That comes from learning to use them in progressively more complex forms. So the challenge for us as educators is, what are those concepts that underpin all of those brilliant ideas we had about what makes a politically literate young adult? And then to work back with them developmentally so that we can have a serious conversation with an 11-year-old, but on terms that an 11-year-old can access and understand. And as the years progress through secondary school, we're ramping up our expectations because we're coming back. So the conversation we have with an 11-year-old about human rights is different from the one we have with the 16-year-old, not because they become magically more politically literate when they're 16, but because we've had related conversations every year for 5 years and we've built their depth of understanding. Okay, Zoe, can we move on to the next slide? But we don't have to kind of worry away for ourselves at what those concepts are, because they're embedded in the curriculum already, and they're the kinds of ones that we would generally kind of expect to see. So in the Welsh curriculum, we have democracy and governance, rights, responsibilities and social action, equality and inequality, and specifically relating to ethnicity, gender and poverty. So what we're suggesting is that one of the key things you need to think about if you're going to build political literacy through the curriculum is to think about how you build those concepts in so that you have a spiral curriculum, so that you can point to progression maps, so you know when you're revisiting concepts like democracy and governance or rights and responsibilities and what the learning is that's age appropriate. Okay, can we jump on, Zoe? And then we're also suggesting stuff that should be very familiar to you, but it's just a reminder in this context that the ways we plan are over different timescales. So there is the entire school journey. Think about those lovely year sevens you get fresh-faced and scrubbed up at the beginning of September, and then think about those teenagers that leave you. That is your 5-year journey that you can plan for political literacy. Then, of course, we have the progress in a whole year. So let's think about how you move someone on from September through to the following July. How are your schemes of work building on each other? And then finally, what's the progression within a unit? So how do we move people on over the course, typically most units, half a term or a month or so. So we need to think about what kind of progression is reasonable across each of those timescales. Okay, thanks, Zoe. And so the next thing we're going to ask you to do, we're going to give you a very brief time, but it's a very big loaded question, is just to think about a unit that you teach in year 7 or 8, so fairly early on in the secondary school life of a student, and then think about what are the key conceptual learning outcomes. So what are those of those 3 sets of concepts that we gave you, or you might have other concepts that you think underpin it. What are the key learning outcomes going on in that unit? If you were to be asked to move that unit to year 11, so let's say it was one of the last things the students studied before they were this politically literate 16-year-old, how would your teaching change? How would you shift up a gear in terms of intellectual demands or the learning demand? Now, we're probably only going to give you 5 minutes. So we're going to put you into small groups of 3 or 4. And it may be that you only have time to listen to 1 or 2 people to share their ideas. So it's probably better to find a willing volunteer, and then the others quiz them and try and get some clarity out of them about exactly what are the concepts and what's the difference between doing it early and late in the secondary journey. Zoe, are you going to magic us into rooms?
I am, except I'm just struggling to find the breakout button option on our system. I'm panicking that it's not here. So what I'm going to suggest is that while I carry on looking, that people take a moment to think about this for the time being, and then we might just feed back to everyone together at the moment, and whilst I try and fix out what's going on with our breakout groups, and I'll be back to you all in just a moment.
Zoe, I think I need to do it for you.
Wow.
So I've just done it, and I'll open the rooms.
Thank you, because I'm not the host. Thank you. There is just an issue. If anybody would like to use the Welsh translation within a breakout whilst we're using breakout, if you could just make us aware in the chat bar now, then we can make sure that's available to you. Okay, I'm going to take that as we're all okay to go off into our breakout rooms then.
Great. Okay, so we're going to just take some very kind of rapid feedback from that thinking activity. So I'll give you 15 seconds to think about what you might say about what conversation you're able to have, and I'll tell you what was happening in my breakout room. We had Aileen, who, and this is one of those interesting things that makes the point that she works in the Senedd and goes out to schools to do their engagement work. And of course, the problem with that is, in terms of progression, she might only get one go at working with those children. So in a sense, they get what she wants to tell them because that's what she needs to tell them, and they might not get another go at that. So it really reinforces for me that kind of challenge. That's fine, because that's what Aileen's doing. She's like the resource you employ, but the teacher then has to plan for progression and have their own story of, why are we getting Aileen in year 7 when the person down the road is getting her in year 11? Why does it make sense for us in our curriculum story, and it makes another kind of sense for them? But one of the things she was talking about was engagement and agency. And I think one of the things in terms of progression, because we all want that, and of course young kids are really up for being engaged and are often really inspiring in terms of political agency, and older children we hope would kind of keep on that. We might be channeling them into voting and other things. But in terms of planning for progression, one of the challenges, I think, is taking that sense of agency or efficacy and helping children understand the full range of ways of political expression and engagement, so they can make nuanced, informed judgments about the best thing to do for this problem. You know, maybe the 11-year-old wants to go and take direct action and just tell adults what they should do for the best, but the 16-year-old is making more nuanced decisions about when to do stuff on their own, when to do stuff, you know, to start a campaign, when to join an existing campaign, when to lobby a member of the Senedd, when to lobby a member of Parliament, when to lobby their head teacher, when to go and do direct action. All of these are kind of more nuanced, politically informed decisions that you might not expect an 11-year-old to be able to make. So that was what was going on in our group and my thinking about that. Does anyone else want to chip in something else that we're talking about in terms of concepts and moving kids on through that journey?
Does anyone in my group want to speak, or do you want me to speak for you? Let me know. Pop it in the chat. Anyone can talk to me? So my group had a group of lots of novices. So I think they thank you, Katie. So they came from all different backgrounds, which was lovely. We had a primary teacher, Spanish languages teacher, English, etc. So everyone was from a very cross-curricular approach, but nobody had sort of taught the topics before, subject before. So it's all very new. Somebody establishing PSHE. So we were just talking about this idea of sort of progress and how you layer it together. So we did take the idea of sort of democracy and voting, and how you can start off small in your sort of local school and saying to people, well, come on guys, you've probably all voted. Primary school children are very good at voting, but what does that mean? Establishing that, then moving it through the local to the national. And in Wales you've got this extra layer of complexity for young people to understand in terms of Senedd and UK Parliament, and then moving that up into thinking about accountability, contact, and again the agency element there as well, of helping young people be involved in not just you can vote, but you can be part of a youth system too. So there's lots of sort of complex and way in which people can sort of spread out what is a basic, or what people might think is a basic procedural, how people vote in elections, into a much richer set of knowledge and lessons that can fit into a range of curriculum opportunities or areas for learning in the new curriculum. Like in English, you can talk about writing to persuade, or evaluating political statements and political manifestos. That would work as well in English as it would in a specialised sort of social studies or citizenship and politics education lesson.
Okay, fantastic. So I think we're going to have to pause it there and move on, because if we're going to stick vaguely to our time, Zoe, we're going to be at the next activity in 10 minutes. So okay. I'm going to hand over to you to start us off thinking about neutrality in all of this journey.
Perfect, thank you. So it's really important, and I think this is a concern that lots of teachers have. It's really important that we do think about remaining neutral within this. And there is an Education Act that says that we must, and the details of that are on there. Most of you will be able to find that in sort of your documents. And there is a document that I'm going to attach to the chat quite soon for you, where all of this is summarised. You may have already seen it advertised. It's one of the first parts of the work that we've been doing in producing some guidance on how to remain impartial while teaching citizenship and politics education. And I really would advise you to have a read and also take part in a questionnaire that you can do on Hub afterwards, because we'd like to produce a final version, taking account of any feedback that you guys have. So it would be really brilliant if you could read that and give us any feedback as well. So what does this really mean in practice then? Let's think about this, because, you know, political directions can seem quite dry, or can seem quite confusing sometimes, but let's think about it. Well, this is from a judge's summary of a case that actually went to court with regards to political impartiality, and you can have a read of it yourself here. But I think the main sort of summary that we need to think about is this idea of political impartiality does not require practitioners to give you equal airtime. And I think that's really important, because some of our practitioners really worry that if you say, let's say, for example, it's an election time and you say that Welsh Labour says they're going to do this, then you have to instantly balance yourself by saying, however, the Conservatives say they're going to do this, or Plaid say they're going to do this. But this is not what we're saying has to happen, and it's not what the Education Act is saying has to happen. What we're saying is that over a period of time, so over your planning, you are able to focus on what one particular group or one particular focus says, but within a series of lessons or over a scheme of work, you must ensure that there has been equal airtime given to different views. Okay, so rather than just sort of giving 3 lessons to one and 1 lesson to cover everything else, that would not be equal airtime, but you can balance it over a period of time when you're assessing particular ideas, a particular viewpoint. And of course, if you're not planning carefully, that won't happen. So how can we do this then? Well, number 1 is by sequencing your content. Look at the sources of information you use and when you are using them. So investigate carefully and think about when and how you're going to put these to use in your lessons. And think about what political perspectives are covered in your lessons and when. Don't just sort of think, oh, I'm going to put that in because I feel like it should be there. Think carefully about how you're using these. Are they being used at the right time and to support the right view? Make sure you have some kind of routine and tools. Have you taught students, and going back to English again here, perhaps, have you, or even any humanities teachers, historians, have you taught students a particular way to analyse documents, newspaper reports, things like that? Do they know how to review these, thinking about looking for one-sidedness, who it's written for, who it's written by, why it could have been published, those kinds of things? Do they have these kind of views? And this is all about developing these habits of critical engagement and critical media literacy. And that stands for when party political broadcasts come out on television and those kinds of things too. So helping the young people think, okay, I need to think really carefully about this. And finally, developing capacity. So this is about helping our young students in front of us develop the ability to be able to offer critically informed opinions. And this will spread completely across the curriculum. They should be able to give you critically informed opinions and look at things through various lenses in terms of subject areas. It shouldn't just be in one area that they do this. So please think very carefully about the different ways in which all subjects are teaching students to be critically, well, just critically engaged in what they're doing. Are you encouraging them to question and think? And how and when do we allow students to express their opinions, and what issues do we allow them to? Are your learners encouraged to say, okay, yes, argue with me. Yes, tell me why you believe that. Yes, but support this. Or is it a kind of classroom where students listen to what you say and take that as the truth? Okay, because what we need to see for a political literate young person is that they are forming their own opinions based on good research, critical engagement, and they are able to express their opinion really well. So moving on to reflection point 2 then, and again, you are going to be you're going to be sent off into discussion groups, and this time you don't need to have particular knowledge, because we're going to give you some scenarios that can occur in any classroom. So I'm going to ask you to think about a topic that you teach that could be considered politically controversial. And in all our subjects, there are things that could be seen as political controversial, whether that's science, geography, history, maths. There's normally something that people can argue about within there in terms of what is politically controversial. And what do you do to ensure that this is impartial? Okay, so it's over time or within the lessons. So think about something that's normally taught on your scheme of work, not something that you're implementing, not something that's new, but something that you know is taught. Why is it politically controversial to some? And this is important as well, in that some people might find things that are taught politically controversial as opposed to others who may accept it. And you may think about different groups within your schools or within your communities that might find some decisions difficult. Okay, and then what do you teach, or what do you do to ensure your teaching is impartial? So time check, Lee, how much time do you want them to have on this one?
Probably just 5 minutes again.
Perfect. Is there anything you want me to add about setting this up?
Yeah, I would just remind people that these reflection points is a good idea to think about what you do to make sure you are impartial and neutral, but also it's always useful to think about experiences you've had where you feel in retrospect you probably weren't sufficiently impartial or neutral, and to remind you that you're not being recorded in the breakout rooms. So be frank in the breakout rooms, be discreet in the main room when you come back and the camera's back on.
Thanks, everyone. You may have been ripped out mid-conversation, as I was, but that's okay. Please don't forget to go back to interpretation and select English if you need to. Okay, time to look at some feedback then. Is any group willing to start sharing about the topics and how they can ensure teaching this is impartial?
Zoe, I'll kick off while people think about this just very quickly, because we had loads of really good issues raised. One was that when you are completely impartial and when you play devil's advocate.
Nice.
Another idea that came up was making sure that you present both sides or two sides to an argument at least, and even if one side is in a minority. But I'm going to come back to that because the example was global warming and climate change, and I think there are different approaches we might take. And someone else was saying, you know, people have their views about what happens in religious education in religious schools, but actually those RE teachers, instead of pushing a certain approach which might be seen as indoctrination, they're actually trying to open up space for the children to make their own considered views, to develop their own considered views. But one of the challenges to the teacher remaining impartial is that the children always want to wheedle out of you what you think about the issue so that they can engage with that. So those were some interesting challenges to neutrality, I thought.
Brilliant, thank you. Oh, I've been there. But what do you think, Miss? But let's tell us. And Wendy said they discussed the difficulties around unacceptable viewpoints. And yeah, we're going to move on to that, I think, in the next section, Wendy. So I'll be interested to know your views when we come to that. If there's anybody else that was in another group who wants to tap anything into the chat, that's a really good way for everyone to see that. We actually started off by saying our group was like, oh, I don't think we do anything. And then talked about some of the ideas that go into debate in English, for instance, organ donation, death penalty, corporal punishment, and realised that all of those issues are political issues because they're sort of founded on law and those kinds of things. So actually our teachers are doing it. Our practitioners are sort of in the classroom doing this stuff, and they just need to make those slightly wider links on what the law says and whether it's Senedd or UK Parliament who has control. So there's some really clear political links there, and it's just about expanding what's already happening and making those links. And I think that's something really clear that's coming through on the new curriculum for Wales, as well as your existing curriculum, that your core content's there and it's still going to work, but it's just about pulling it out a little bit more broadly to meet these new progression statements. So it sounds like there's some really good stuff going on from the teachers that we have online, which is really excellent. Thanks everyone for your participation there. Let's move on.
Okay. Are you pulling up the PowerPoint again? I think it's me talking about controversial issues.
Yeah, I didn't realise I wasn't sharing, sorry. I thought I was.
So, well, while that's coming up, so what we've argued so far is that we need to kind of think serious about what the learning is that's going on when we have these conversations in class. It's not just telling people how to vote. There's this kind of deeper conceptual development, deeper thinking going on over the years. We've said that the teacher has to maintain an impartial role, but we've also said that's not simplistic, it's more nuanced, and that has to be played out across your planning as well. And then we've got to this position of thinking about lots of the issues that arise in political conversations in classrooms that are teaching politics and citizenship are what we might call controversial issues. Now, I think controversiality sits at the heart of most political issues. And Bernard Crick, who is the godfather of citizenship education for many of us, said something, I'm paraphrasing, along the lines of, when you and I have disagreements about the right thing to do, we call that an ethical argument. But when that is translated to a societal level and someone has to make a decision, that becomes political. So if you're talking about abortion or ages of consent or drug, whether it's appropriate to take a drug or not, that's a personal decision for you, and we might have different thoughts on that. But someone has to set the legal framework in which we make those decisions, and someone will outlaw some things that you think is okay. That's when that ethical debate moves firmly into the territory of politics. And most political issues are controversial. But by controversial, we mean some specific things. And this is the generally agreed upon list of defining characteristics. They're not easily settled by facts alone. So the more facts you teach in the classroom, you will not bring everyone to the same point of consensus. We're going to have a political discussion. It's going to be informed by facts, but it won't be settled by facts. There are legitimate alternative opinions. So at the end of a good lesson, the children will have a range of opinions still, all drawing on the same facts, but they will justify a range of political opinions. No, but that could be anything. I mean, we could have a discussion about whether cheese or ham is better on our sandwiches, and that won't be resolved by fact. So it's not just having a range of alternative opinions that makes it controversial. The controversiality comes in that they often create conflict or division, and that often fuels an intensely emotional response. And because this is also controversial, sometimes there's even a controversial debate about whether this topic is controversial. So some people will say, don't try and make this out to be controversial. We all know right from wrong. You're just pretending it, or you're being willful at saying this is difficult. And some issues are controversial in some places at some times for some people and not for others. So the issue of controversiality is important because it sets us up for having certain types of conversation, but it is itself a really tricky, controversial issue. Okay, move us on, Zoe. And whilst that's an interesting debate to have about how you define a controversial issue, it's not just a philosophical, sidestep away from practical teaching, because it has really important ramifications for teaching. Because if a topic is controversial, then certain things follow for your teaching. The first is that it would be wrong to promote a particular opinion about that issue because it's a genuinely open issue. That means practitioners should be impartially presenting a range of viewpoints to enable learners to understand them and support learners to develop their own opinions. It also means practitioners are helping learners understand the perennial issues underlying the specific issue. So this is about avoiding that the citizenship or the politics class becoming a rag bag of 1,001 issues. All of those issues we've talked about so far, so abortion or drugs legislation or all the rest of it, we might say underpinning that are notions of rights, or notions about right from wrong, or notions about how far the state can have an impact on individuals and curtail our individual freedom. Generally, under every controversial issue, there are one or more really juicy concepts that lie underneath them. And we might teach 6 or 7 hot issues in a half term, but underlying them all might be the same perennial issues or the same concepts: equality, justice, human rights, individual responsibility, collective responsibility, whatever it may be. It doesn't follow that because you're teaching impartially, then you must always be entirely neutral in some kind of cold fish way in the classroom. There are a whole range of different things you might do. Devil's advocate is being as provocative as you can to represent an opinion which is not represented in the classroom. But you need to make it clear that you're not just being a vehement personal proponent of this idea, that you're doing it to provoke the children to reconsider their arguments and to open up their thinking. And then finally, practitioners have to be careful about expressing their own opinion. This came up immediately in our small group discussion. I don't think there is any obvious right or wrong answer, but the clear guiding principle for it should be there must be an educational purpose. So there is a time and a place for sharing your opinion, and that's embedded in the relationships and the kind of classroom climate that you think is appropriate to develop. But always starting off by saying what you think is obviously a no-no. Always jumping in and using your strength of argument to convince other people that they're wrong is a no-no. You're sharing it in the spirit, when you are sharing it, of being a participant in a conversation with a genuine exchange of ideas. And I think what came through very quickly when we were talking about this in the context of RE was you would probably hold back on it because you don't want to unduly influence what the students think. But on the other hand, if the students really care what you think, then maybe it would be wrong to withhold it forever. Maybe you bring it in later on and you talk about how you can live with differences of opinions, and that's part of living together in a diverse society. Okay, move us on again, please, Zoe. So one of the things that makes this interesting and tricky is that, as I said, what counts as controversial changes over time for different people in different places. So here's an illustration. So, Diana Hess has called this tipping points. And what's interesting about this is the tipping point isn't set in stone. You may feel, because of the community you're teaching in, or because of the kids in your class, that certain issues have achieved a tipping point into controversiality that isn't the case for other people teaching in other areas. So give us the first example, if you will, Zoe. So I've got a couple of historical examples to illustrate this point of tipping points. In the 19th century, gay rights, for most people, weren't controversial, because for most people it was clearly wrong to be gay. This was at the height of homosexuality being medicalized, and if you were gay, you didn't seek liberation. You probably sought either living your life in the shadows, or you went for a medical intervention. So it wasn't controversial, it was a settled opinion, but probably not in the way that we would be happy to live with today. Next bit, please. So there was a period of intense controversiality when people were kind of marching on the streets and interrupting political meetings, and, you know, being sat on by newscasters on BBC because they didn't like legislation going through Parliament, literally kind of fighting in TV studios and Parliament and all the rest of it. So there was a period when this was incredibly controversial. It was up for grabs, and it was perfectly okay to have a range of opinions in schools about what would happen. And move us on, Zoe. And now they're not really controversial in the same way that they were historically, because it's been largely settled. And I don't just mean that in some kind of liberal, self-satisfied way that we're all reasonable now. What I mean by that is there is legislation that mentions sexuality as a protected characteristic to maintain equality. So it's not like saying, well, you think homosexuality is good, I think it's really bad. It kind of has been settled in terms of legislation and a collective social moral position on this, because regardless of what you think in your personal ethics, it is a legal principle that people be treated the same, whether they're gay, straight, or anything else in the rainbow of possibilities. Okay, give us the next historical example. 19th century slavery was intensely controversial. Some people were arguing for it. I mean, when it was finally abolished in the British Empire, it wasn't the slaves who were compensated, it was the slave owners who had lost their valuable assets. So that illustrates how this was far from a done deal, even at the time when we were resolving it in terms of legislation. Move us on. And of course, they're not controversial. It's not controversial to say that slavery is a bad thing. That doesn't mean it has been resolved as a global issue. It doesn't mean that you might not do a campaign in school with young people who care about other young people's plights around the world, but it just means it's a political struggle to achieve something which generally is a consensus political position that it's a wrong thing to happen. Okay, Zoe, move us on again, thanks. So that sets the scene for a task we're going to ask you to do, which I think Zoe's going to set up for us.
Sorry, I was muted. In your chat bar, you should see that there is a scenarios file attached. You should be able to download that. If you have a problem, please let me know. And in your breakout rooms, there are 3 scenarios for you to look at. Depending on time, I think we might give you a scenario each to look at, and then you can feedback on them. For each one, I'd like you to identify we'd like you to identify the problem. Do you think it could have been prevented from arising? What should the practitioner do standing in that class at that moment? And what could they plan as any follow-up response in terms of dealing with the class afterwards, next lesson, or a few lessons time? Okay, so time check, Lee. Do we think it's a scenario each, or are people going to be able to move through a few of them?
I would say if we take 10 minutes, then it might make sense if people start with the number for the group they're allocated to. So scenario 1, if you're in group 1, if you exhaust it, then obviously move on to another one.
Fantastic. Okay, everyone. So check that you can access the scenarios. They're a PDF file attached to the chat. Hopefully you can download those. Join your group. So if you're a group 1, scenario 1, group 2, start with scenario 2, group 3, start with scenario 3. Get as far as you can and then go back to 1, 2, or 3, depending on where you started. See you all soon. Okay, well, I don't know about you, but we had a very good discussion. I'm afraid we only got through one scenario, but hopefully you guys managed to discuss yours in as much detail as we did. So I'm going to ask for feedback from the groups, and then we're going to talk around some ideas in which you can approach issues like this. And it was interesting. I think probably some of these things come up in classrooms across the world, if we're honest with each other, and young people are young people and they react in the same way. So can I start with scenario 2, please? Is there someone that can feedback from scenario 2 to start with? It's all gone quiet. I'm going to pick on scenario 1 then, because that's the one we did, and I know that there were 2 people that were fabulous and had similar experiences. So can I ask Elizabeth, are you able to unmute and talk about what happened to you and explain the context you were doing that as well, please?
Yeah, so we were looking at, well, it kind of came from the pupils. So we do watch News Round with the pupils. And in the local news, there was some immigrants that had been moved into an army camp quite close to the school. But the kind of the discussion really came from outside the school, from the parents' point of views, and it was kind of quite heated. So we made it a topic. It was actually called "Don't Hate, Educate." So it was something. It was alongside something that was done in Youth Parliament through the Senedd. But it was actually looking then at migration and immigration, and actually defining an immigrant. And we did look at it from lots of different perspectives and have speakers in. But I think something that we learned from a school was actually in the classroom, we were having quite controlled, well, interesting discussions, looking at it from lots of different sides. But actually the children then were going home into environments where it was very one-sided, and because they were primary school pupils, it was kind of quite hard knowing that they were going home and having then their parents' perspectives being shown, and it was putting the children in quite a kind of fragile political position. But we kind of did our best to educate them as much as possible and have a balanced view. But yeah, it was interesting.
Thank you. And I just want to point out that you were at your training school, weren't you, when you did that?
I was. So I was on my placement, so I learned a lot. Yeah.
Fantastic. And that's fantastic work. And I think that's a really important point to raise, that sometimes when we are pointing these things out to young people, we're some of the first people to get them to question what their parents are saying, or perhaps even think in a different perspective to their parents. That can be quite difficult for us, but also quite difficult for our learners in the classroom to hear, oh, perhaps what I'm hearing at home isn't right. And I can think in a different way. And that can cause challenges from home. And that's why it's so important to have an SLT who are behind you. And that leads me straight on to our next explanation from Katie.
Hello. Yeah, I think it was a comic relief lesson that we were delivering on refugees. And I had a student in year 9 who had some rather outspoken views about refugees, saw them in quite a negative light. So he was expressing these views in class. So I allowed other students to challenge his views and have a slight discussion, but then moved the lesson on. However, during one of the tasks, he felt rather than, sorry, my children, girls can help. He felt he didn't want to take part in the activity and wrote to me a letter expressing his views and his disappointment with what I was delivering. which I then found at the end of the lesson when they'd handed in their work. So I took that straight to leadership, to one of the child protection officers, just to express that when he had been upset from the lesson, and that I didn't want to have imposed my views too much, and explain that they had been challenged to a certain point. She then met with the student to discuss the issue, to make sure that he wasn't too upset from the lesson, and I suppose also to try and have a dialogue with him about some of his views, which did result in a parental complaint, and you could see that his views were very much from the political view at home. So again, management were able to explain, I suppose, why we were teaching certain things and having these discussions, and I felt supported as a practitioner, and hopefully the student and parents, they were heard and they had a voice as well.
Thank you. Lee, anything from your group? What did you?
First of all, I'm going to just put on my timekeeper hat and say that we only have about 10 minutes to ride to a graceful end. But before you then pick up the PowerPoint and finish us off, we had a brilliant range of experiences we were talking about, you stumble into an activity, you get the kids to do their manifesto, you think they're going to present their ideas, and the first person that pops up is presenting a relatively hard, far right range of opinions, which is going to be upsetting for some of the other learners in the classroom. So we had a range of ideas from close it down, but explain exactly why, talk about offensiveness and people's, this is not necessarily an open public forum. People don't come to school to be offended or upset or have their personal life questioned. So, give a reason, make it educational, challenge people if you feel that you can in the moment, and explore their ideas. As a teacher with a duty of care, think about having a conversation with them about where their ideas came from. You might need to think about whether this is someone who is being drawn into fairly radical extreme groups, and whether there's a safeguarding issue you want to follow up on. But also we talked about framing it as a rights issue, that yes, very often children will tell you, well, I've got a right to my own opinion, but simultaneously other people have a right to their protected characteristics, to live their ethical life, to feel like school is a place where they're valued. And so you set it up as contradictory rights in tension, and how we're going to resolve them today is you're not going to say your piece. So it's some powerful learning that can come out of that teacher intervention, rather than just close it down and leave someone feeling wounded and ignored.
Thank you. Okay. So it sounds like across the discussion groups, everybody had some really good ideas and were already delivering some nice, good practice. So what we've come up with here are some general planning ideas that you can put into place to think about preempting or preventing some of these situations coming. So for example, the manifesto activity, how could we have sort of prevented having to react on the spot and make sure that it hopefully didn't occur in the first place? So looking at giving learners guidance on areas to write about, leaving out the areas, for instance, on immigration if we know it's going to be contentious, thinking about just getting them to think about environment or health policy, and know your group in advance for something like this, and perhaps challenging them to write for a particular political party, left-leaning, right-leaning, and getting them to think from the opposite point of view than their natural state, because it's always good, as we've heard, to think outside of their own perspectives, and that's quite challenging, but also helps them see there is a different perspective to their own. Thinking about perhaps the immigration one, how could we prevent this? Unplanned responses or student responses in class, they know more than we do. It could be quite difficult, especially if they've got lots of information at their fingertips, and they can kind of make us feel like we don't know much. So yes, certainly all the ideas that we talked about already, and then saying pick up on it later, we need to move on. I'm stopping the conversation now because we need to focus on, and just like Katie did already in her example, then focusing on safeguarding and follow up if you need to, and identifying where the information came from should you need to. Is it family, or are students coming from somewhere else with this? What do we need to be more concerned about with? And then your follow-up planning. So conspiracy theories is a key area there. We gave you the example of the anti-vax conversation. More students use the alternative social media to get information now than we could ever keep in touch with. So don't be afraid to say to classes, I haven't heard about this, I don't know. Go away and investigate further. And you don't want to increase your conversation with young people there, your learners, because you may well be increasing the spread of incorrect information. When you go back to the issue after you've found out about it, you can offer a debunked view, and you can do that as well by offering a distancing technique. So rather than tackling it head on and saying to them you're wrong and this is why you're wrong, you could look at a similar situation, help them by debunking that, and then making the connection. So it's that engaged and critical thinking that we spoke about quite near the beginning of the evening that will help young people to do this. And the more critically engaged they become all the way through, the better they will become at identifying conspiracy theories and such for themselves. And yeah, Wendy's put in here the idea of empathy in general can be useful for addressing these issues, so helping our young people to do that. So we're moving on now to general sort of principles for your practice that can be instilled, and this will literally be a rush through because time always escapes us. I can't remember, am I starting or are you, Lee?
You're going to kick off with this one?
I'm going to kick off, perfect. So content and conceptual development, they need to go hand in hand. It's hard for young people to look at context without concepts. It's hard to operationalize a concept without content. So they have to happen together, but you need to be confident about what learning will happen and careful about the issues that you choose. So don't just choose to teach an issue because it's in the news or it's a certain day. Make sure that if it is a day that you want to mark, say Human Rights Day, 10th of December, you have a purpose for doing that. And thinking about your sequencing and progression. Are you comparing these contexts around? Are you actually deepening the students' knowledge, or are you just repeating activities that they've already done? How is their development going on here? And are you taking the concrete to more abstract reasoning? So Lee spoke a moment ago about rights and sort of comparing rights, or how we have to balance rights. So something like that, young people, can be quite difficult for them to understand that rights can sort of rights can compete with each other, and we sometimes have to look at how we balance those rights and which rights almost overrule one another at certain times. And that's an important sort of abstract reasoning for them to develop, but by giving them, and we'll talk about this later, by giving them certain resources, it can really help them understand that. And are they engaging with ever greater complex situations? Have they got the fundamentals to be able to then apply that? That can even be basics of using language and specific language about a topic, and then being able to apply it to a situation and draw out the key content from that. Over to you, Lee.
Okay, so the second principle that we're drawing out of the conversation we've had so far is taking the concept of impartiality and thinking about it as a challenge to your planning over time. So the way you achieve impartiality is by planning it into your provision. So when we're looking at a sequence of work that we're planning, or a project we're about to start off on, what are your go-to sources? I mean, I suspect my Google search engine at home has long since worked out that I prefer to read The Guardian, and it gives me The Guardian every time I search for today's news items. But I can't only teach from The Guardian. So how do I make sure there are a range of sources and I don't just use my own default mechanisms? When do we reflect on our own views? It's very difficult to do that in the moment. So we have to look back and think about a scheme of work before we've taught it and ask ourselves about, is it clear what my line is on this? And is it clear what other legitimate lines of inquiry might be or interpretations might be? And are they all represented equally and fairly? And then think about what ideas you naturally tend to challenge. When you're observing a class, it's much easier to see this dynamic than when you're teaching it, but you will see teachers accepting some ideas and then moving on quickly, listening to other ideas and nodding and saying, does anyone like to agree, or let's expand this together? And then other ideas always get questioned. But what's the logic for that? Because you send out these very obvious messages about whose ideas are actually acceptable to you, even if you never say what you think. And I think a big part of that is building these routines. So we mentioned this earlier on. When I was a history teacher, we used to have the poster up of the W questions: what, when, who, why, when, and all the rest of it. There are some great questions from Tony Benn, which are a bit similar. It's kind of, in any scenario you're studying, who has power? Where did they get it from? How do you hold them to account? And how do they get rid of you? Or how do we get rid of them? How do they lose their power? Those are brilliant questions. The fact they came from a socialist doesn't mean they're not fairly good, neutral political questions to ask of any scenario. So to get the young people used to some kind of routine that leads them always to ask the same questions of the same people, of the same scenarios or different scenarios as you encounter them, is a really good way to move the onus onto them. By following the routine, they're not waiting for you to prompt them to be critical, they're doing it autonomously. And then this idea of empathy is really important, because the more people we look at, the more opinions we understand, the more we come to understand why controversial issues are politically complex. It's only by understanding that other people have equally heartfelt opinions about them, but have diametrically opposite views of what the right solution is, that we come to understand what the challenge of politics is. If we think we can always get our own way, then we're always frustrated by democratic politics. If we understand that no one ever gets their own way the whole time, then we understand why it's worth investing time in democratic conversations. Okay, Zoe.
Okay, so the next idea that works really well, especially if you're looking for resources to put into your planning, is looking at depth into case studies. So case studies have been proven to work really, really well with young people, normally because it means that they can identify and really get to know characters and situations, and they can apply knowledge to a real life situation. So when we select our case studies, we need to do so carefully and with a clear learning purpose. Frequently, I think people go to the well-known case studies when we deal with things like rights. We'll find Nelson Mandela coming up, Malala will come up quite frequently, lots of names that people are very familiar with. But sometimes looking at those that are less familiar are really positive, because the students then can start looking at them, and you can start looking at them with your learners in terms of concepts and those perennial issues that underlie a case study, and highlight the things that you really want them to get out of the lessons. And you can then help, or the depth study cases can help you make a connection between the abstracts. And if we think about it in terms of human rights, for example, the abstract idea of the rights and people's rights not being upheld, or people having their rights oppressed by a government that's meant to uphold their rights and protect their rights, into a concrete example of a person being denied their rights because of their homosexuality, because of their gender. I did a depth study case with a year 8 group about a woman who started a helpline for abused women in Russia, and they read 2 lines on the board to start the lesson, and it was from a police officer who spoke to a husband and said, if you are going to kill her, can you make sure it's done quietly? And that was after the police had been informed that this lady's life was in threat. And of course that case study instantly started started to make them think, okay, why? They had no idea who the case study was on until the end of it. And by the end of it, they were using the case study to highlight so many issues and so many inequalities, not just in Russia, but also throughout local communities, and issues in the UK as well, that they could make connections with. So it's very important to think about, read any case studies that you choose, think about the concepts and the main sort of curriculum areas that you want to highlight. So look at who is represented in the case study and what impression is created by it. So we don't really want to use a case study that creates a victim narrative, for example. A case study, the way it's written, just creates sort of sympathy, but neither do we want to use a case study that just creates certain people as always looking like activists or sort of aggressive activists in areas. We need to think carefully about who we're choosing and why. And then think about the sequence of your lessons and what you're developing. Does your case study introduce the idea that you would like to teach? Does it illustrate an idea already taught? So are you going to teach about the complex nature of women's rights through, for example, the case study, like I did? Or are you going to explain the concept of women's rights to young people and then say, let's have a look at this case study and can you apply women's rights to it? And it's up to you, because you will know your classes, to see which you think will work best for them. Over to you, Lee.
Okay, and then the last principle, it's obvious in what you've said already in this workshop, but is embracing responsive pedagogies. And the only thing I'm going to say here, just to finish up on, is that we need to, when we are responding to the situation that children are in, it's important to respond to that, to value what they bring with them, but also to resist defaulting into a deficit view of what communities they come from and what kinds of opinions are in those communities. I think this comes across very strongly. If you're the kind of person that is a politics or a citizenship teacher, very often you have a very strong commitment to social justice, and so it's very easy to to see all sorts of problematic views in the communities and to think that your intervention is going to be somehow a kind of balance. But really, and this came through in what people were saying, we need to be really clear that what that means is being open-minded and entertaining a range of opinions might be personally difficult for some of the young people who are in your classroom. So part of helping them to engage is giving them the kind of tools to engage with those difficult conversations in their families and in their communities and with other people that they might have a different opinion from. So it's kind of equipping young people to start to entertain new ideas. They might return to the ideas they started with for different reasons, and recognizing that that's perfectly legitimate and that there will always be a range of different opinions. So just making sure that we're responsive in a way which leaves room and respect for other people's opinions. And all of that, I think, just to reiterate what we've been saying, has to be laid down in your plans, because none of us wants to be the teacher who stands up, puts themselves in the middle of a heated debate with 30 fired up adolescents who are all going to go home and generate a set of complaints from their parents, when we haven't got a policy, we haven't discussed this with school leaders, no one in our department knows what we're doing, our resources are actually quite biased because we downloaded them the day before because we thought this would be a hot topic. All of that is a recipe for disaster, and it's all headed off by just some good old-fashioned planning. So that's our resounding conclusion, I think. And then I think we might stop the filming and just go to some questions, because I'm aware we're out of time. So this is kind of into extra time for anyone that has any burning issues they want to mention. I should also just say, if you haven't already had a look at it, the guidance that we wrote is on the hub. If you just search for teacher impartiality and HWB, then you'll find it. And in there, some of these broad principles are boiled down to a kind of checklist, do's and don'ts, things to check before you embark on teaching difficult political issues, just to make sure you've kind of covered all of those bases. Particularly useful, I think, if you're working with less experienced colleagues who might, you know, what we want to do is preemptively stop people falling into the bear traps. So anyway, over to you for any questions or final comments.
Perhaps, Lee, I could just say thank you to everybody for attending. Do stay on and ask questions. I'm sorry that we've run a little bit over time today. We hope the session has been helpful. A big thank you to Zoe and to Lee. And I'm going to pause the recording there, and then if anybody would like to ask questions, you're very, very welcome to stay on and do that.